In our lesson today, we're going to be looking at Genesis chapters 8 and 9 and some lessons that we can learn from Noah. Now, when we think about Noah, we usually think about him, how he built the ark, how he and his family were saved from the flood. And that is one of the more well-known events in the Bible. Children from the very beginning, as they begin growing up, they learn about Noah and the flood and how Noah and his family and all the animals that were on the ark, all of them were saved. As we get grown up and we get to be adults, we have other lessons that we learn from Noah and the flood about the obedience that Noah had, that God expects, that God punishes sin. There are a lot of lessons, no matter if we're young or old, that we can learn from Noah and the flood. But what about the events after the flood? Sometimes we don't think about those as often as we do about the events leading up to and during the flood. But there are some important lessons for us to remember in the events that happened after the flood. So that's what we're going to talk about in our lesson here today. What lessons can we learn from Noah and the things that happened after the flood? In Genesis chapter 8, we have the end of the flood and Noah and his family leaving the ark. Verses 18 and 19. It says, "So Noah went out, and his sons and his wife and his sons' wives with him, every beast, every creeping thing, and every bird, everything that moves on the earth, went out by their families from the ark." All of the living things on the world, every living creature, man and animal, had all been destroyed during the flood. The only ones who remained, the only ones who survived, were the ones who were on the ark. Noah and his family and the animals that were there in the ark, they were the only ones to survive who were living there on the land. They were the only ones to survive. Well, they come out of the ark, but then there are certain things that the Bible tells us that happened after they left the ark. Well, what is it that happened once they left the ark? Well, the first thing that we see after the flood, Noah exits the ark. Now, this might seem obvious. This might seem, well, why do we need to talk about Noah leaving the ark? This is important because this is one of those lessons that we might just overlook and not think too much of, but this is important. Noah went out of the ark. But there are several things that had to happen before this. Over in Genesis chapter 8 and verse 2, it says, "The fountains of the deep and the floodgates of the sky were closed, and the rain from the sky was restrained." So you have to have the rain stopped. Verse 3, "The water receded steadily from the earth, and at the end of 150 days the water decreased." So you had the flood, the rains from heaven fell down, the waters from the deep rose up and flooded the entire earth. Well, the rain stopped. And then you have the water begin to recede on the land. Verse 4, "On the 7th month, on the 17th day of the month, the ark rested on the mountains of Ararat." So the ark had to come to rest. In verse 7, Noah sends out a raven in order to try to get some idea of whether there was any land, whether there was anything, any idea of when they might be able to leave. After the raven, he sends out a dove, 3 times sends out a dove. And in verse 13, "It came about on the 601st year, in the 1st month, on the 1st of the month, the water was dried up from the earth. Then Noah removed the covering of the ark and looked, and behold, the surface of the ground was dried up." So Noah, by this point, he could see that the ground was dry. There was already evidence that this was the case because from his sending the dove out. And now you have Noah opening up the cover of the ark and seeing that there is dry ground. And so all of this has happened before them, but Noah didn't leave yet. Noah didn't immediately leave the ark. But when we've read those verses, there are a few times where you see that there are dates that are given or a certain time of the year when this was given. The timeline is important. We have Noah back in chapter 7. The flood came in his 600th year. When he was in his 600th year, the flood came. Verse 6, "Noah was 600 years old when the flood water came upon the earth. And then Noah and his sons and his wife and his sons' wives with him entered the ark because of the water of the flood. But then you skip down to verse 11. In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month, on the 17th day of the month, on the same day, all the fountains of the great deep burst open, and the floodgates of the sky were open. So here they were. They were on the ark, and everything started happening. You have the flood begin. You have the waters coming down from heaven, and then the flood waters rising up. When did this happen? 600th year, the 2nd month, and the 17th day of the month. Well, notice as we get the water prevailed for 150 days. In the 7th month, the water or the ark settles on the mountains of Ararat. And then we read in verse 13, the 601st year, the 1st month, 1st day of the month, you have the waters dried up and Noah is able to see that the ground is dry. So here you have, at the end of almost a year, after being in the ark for almost a year, in that confined space with the same people, the same family members who were there, all of the animals that were there in the ark, in there for almost a year, rocking around on the water as the ark was floating on the water, almost a year. You can imagine how eager they would have been to get out of the ark, to get out, to get onto dry land. How eager they would have been, how eager we would have been if we put ourselves in that situation. How eager would we be to get out of the ark, to be anywhere but there? Almost a year they were in the ark, but it was almost 2 months later that he actually exited the ark. You see in chapter 8 and verse 14, in the 2nd month, on the 27th day of the month, the earth was dry. Then God spoke to Noah, saying, Go out of the ark, you and your wife and your sons' wives with you. Bring out every living thing of all flesh that is with you, birds and animals and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth, that they may breed abundantly on the earth and be fruitful and multiply on the earth. They were on the ark for almost a year when they were settled and they could see that there was dry ground out there. Why did they wait almost 2 months longer before they left the ark? What were they waiting for? Well, they were waiting for God to tell them to leave the ark. That's when they left. They didn't see that, well, everything's dry. It looks like everything's safe. Surely we can get out of the ark and at least look around. No, they didn't do any of that. They waited for God to tell them, now is the time to go out. That's when Noah waited. Noah waited until God said. When God said, then he was able to leave the ark. That's when he knew that was the time to do it. This is a lesson for us on authority. When we think about certain things that we think we ought to do or wonder if we ought to do them, we need to make sure that we are doing things that God authorizes us to do. Not just assume that what we think is right is something that is what we ought to do. Colossians 3 and verse 17 tells us that whatever we do, in word or deed, we are to do it in the name of the Lord, which means by his authority. Not just what we assume will be right. The wise man warned in Proverbs 14 and verse 12 that there is a way that seems right to a man, but its end is the way of death. We look at Noah here. Noah didn't just do what seemed right and what he might have been eager to do in just leaving the ark as soon as he saw dry ground. He waited for God's instructions. He waited to know this is what God wanted him to do. So what happened after the flood? Well, Noah went out of the ark, but it wasn't until God told him to go out of the ark. The lesson there for us on authority and doing what God has told us to do. Another lesson we see that when Noah left the ark after the flood, he built an altar. In Genesis chapter 8 and verse 20, then Noah built an altar to the Lord and took of every clean animal and every clean bird and offered burnt offerings on the altar. This was the first thing that Noah did when he left the ark. We already read verses 18 and 19 that Noah left the ark and all the animals, all of them left the ark. And the first thing they did was there in verse 20. Noah built an altar to the Lord and took of every clean animal and every clean bird and offered burnt offerings on the altar. This shows us that this offering was a priority. Offering these sacrifices to God was important before anything else. You think of all the things that they could have done and they may have wanted to do once they finally got off the ark. They had over a year to think about what they could do once they got off the ark. The first thing that Noah did was to build an altar to make sacrifices to God. These sacrifices were an expression of gratitude that God saved them and God provided for them through the flood, that they had everything that they needed, even though it may not have been the most comfortable existence there on the ark with all of those animals. They had everything that they needed. They were saved through the flood. And now they had the assurance that God was going to provide for them from that point forward. They were offering sacrifices to God as an expression of gratitude. Today, we show gratitude to God through offerings, not exactly the same type of offering. We're not offering animals on an altar, but we do offer service to God. We do make sacrifices of that sort for the same reason. In Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 28, it says, "Therefore, since we receive a kingdom which cannot be shaken, let us show gratitude, by which we may offer to God an acceptable service with reverence and awe." Show gratitude. We're going to make sacrifices. We're going to make offerings. We're going to worship God. We have to do it with gratitude. That is why Noah was making these offerings. He was thankful to God for delivering them and for providing for them. And notice what it said in that verse, and we read that in verse 20. Noah sacrificed of every clean animal and every clean bird, that there was nothing that he withheld. This was a complete sacrifice. Everything that God would have accepted, Noah was willing to make that offering to God. He made a complete sacrifice. He didn't hold anything back. There's a lesson for us here on worshiping God and serving God. We are to do this wholeheartedly. We're not to hold anything back. In fact, Paul said over in Romans chapter 12 and verse 1 that we are even presenting ourselves as a living sacrifice to God. We don't hold anything back. We're not trying to give the Lord part of our life and then reserve part of it for ourselves and whatever we want to do. We are giving everything to Him. Noah offered to God. It was a priority. It was complete, and it was not holding anything back. We worship God. We serve God. It has to be a priority. And we cannot hold anything back that the Lord expects us to do. The next thing that we read about is God stating His promise and His covenant to Noah and his family. Over in Genesis chapter 8, verses 21 and 22, says, "The Lord smelled the soothing offering. The Lord said to Himself, I will never again curse the ground on account of man. For the intent of man's heart is evil from his youth, and I will never again destroy every living thing as I have done. While the earth remains, seed time and harvest, and cold and heat, and summer and winter, and day and night shall not cease." God here in this passage is promising His ongoing providence, that He would continue to provide for man. There would be seed time, harvest, cold and heat, summer, winter, day and night, that the world would continue. Paul would say over in Lystra in Acts chapter 14 and verse 17 that this God's blessings and His providence was a witness to him, that people in every nation all over the world in any period of time, they would be able to see that as the world continues, as they are able to survive, this is evidence that God is providing these things, that God is there. And this promise was made despite man's corruption. Notice what we read in verse 21. It says, the Lord said, I will never again curse the ground on account of man. But then He says, the intent of man's heart is evil from his youth. God recognized man is going to continue to sin. Man is going to continue to act in a corrupt manner. Even Noah, we're going to talk about something that Noah did wrong in just a minute. But even Noah was going to act in a way at different times that was contrary to the will of God. God knew this. And God still made this promise that he would continue to provide for man. Jesus talked about how he blesses the righteous and the wicked. He causes the rain to fall on the just and the unjust. Why does he do this? Because he loves man. Because he wants man to turn to him, to come to him. Again, going back to the verse we referenced in Acts chapter 14, that this ongoing providence is a witness to God. God is wanting man to turn to him, to recognize him, to follow him. And so God provides his blessings and provides the good things of this creation, not only to the righteous, but also to the wicked, to help turn them to him as they can see his goodness. But God also made a promise regarding destruction. As he just destroyed the world with a flood, he says in Genesis chapter 9, in verse 9, he says, "Now behold, I myself do establish my covenant with you and with your descendants after you, and with every living creature that is with you, the birds, the cattle, and every beast of the earth with you, and all that comes out of the ark, even every beast of the earth. I establish my covenant with you, and all flesh shall never again be cut off by the water of the flood. Neither shall there again be a flood to destroy the earth." God said, "This is the sign of the covenant which I am making between me and you and every living creature that is with you for all successive generations. I set my bow in the cloud, and it shall be as a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. It shall come about when I bring a cloud over the earth that the bow will be seen in the cloud. Now remember my covenant which is between me and you and every living creature of all flesh, and never again shall the water become a flood to destroy all flesh. When the bow is in the cloud, then I will look upon it, to remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature of all flesh that is on the earth." And God said to Noah, "This is the sign of the covenant which I have established between me and all flesh that is on the earth." God is talking about the sign of the covenant, the rainbow that would be in the cloud, the rainbow that would be visible. This was a sign of the covenant, that God would no longer destroy the earth with water as he did. Now, it's important to understand how God worded that there. He said he would never again destroy the world with water. It would not be destroyed in the same way that it was this time. But as we talked about in our lesson last week from 2 Peter chapter 3, God is going to destroy the earth one day, not with water, where the water is going to destroy all living creatures on the earth. And then you have Noah and those who are on the ark, they're going to live on the earth after that. He's going to destroy the earth later with fire. And the elements will be destroyed. The elements will melt with intense heat. The earth and its works are going to be burned up. The world is going to be destroyed again. But it's not going to be done by water. It's not going to be done the way that God has done it here. And so there's a promise, this everlasting covenant that God makes with man, that he's not going to destroy the earth with water. But, as Peter pointed out in 2 Peter chapter 3, this is a lesson for us. This shows us that God has the power to destroy those who do not follow him. And he will destroy, he has the power to do this. He will destroy the earth one day, not by water, but by fire. Then the final thing that we see after the flood, over in Genesis chapter 9, is that Noah planted a vineyard. Now, when we think about this, we might think of this as completely detached from the story of the flood, and in some ways it is. But this is an important lesson for us, and it's included in the Bible for a reason. This is one of the things that happened after the flood, and this is important enough that God, by inspiration, put it in the Bible for us to learn from. So what can we learn from this? Well, in Genesis chapter 9, verse 20, "Then Noah began farming and planted a vineyard. He drank of the wine and became drunk and uncovered himself in his tent." Now, the events that followed were going to result in the son of Noah, Ham, and his descendant Canaan being cursed. And you have all of this happening, but it started with Noah planting a vineyard and then using the things that were that were in the vineyard, that were produced by the vineyard, to produce wine, and becoming drunk and becoming uncovered in his tent. Ham would be cursed. Ham's son Canaan would be cursed after this. But all of this happened because of what Noah did. Now, when Noah planted the vineyard and it produced the fruit that he was expecting, that was intended to, this is, again, going back to the point we made about God's providence. This is by God's providence that the vineyard was fruitful, that it produced what it did. It acted as God created it. God created things in the beginning in Genesis chapter 1 that they would yield after their kind, whether it's plants or animals. In this case, with the plants and the fruit of the vineyard, that it would produce after its kind. It was simply acting the way that God intended it. So what was the problem? What do we have to learn from this? Well, the lesson is that it is possible to take the good things that God has given and abuse them, or use them improperly, use them in such a way that we are actually guilty of sin. He became drunk. The Bible many times talks about the sin of drunkenness. Well, Noah was using something that was part of God's creation. He was using something that was a blessing from God, but he was using it in a way that was improper. And there are a lot of ways that we can do this. That you have the blessings that God has given as far as our material possessions, our money, our jobs, even our family. All these things are blessings from God. But we can use them in a way that is contrary to the will of God. We're not being good stewards of what God has blessed us with. We're not honoring God with the things that we have, whether it's our money or our jobs or anything else. But instead, we're using it in a way that is contrary to the will of God. We're doing it for our own selfish ambitions. And we're acting in a way that is corrupt. We are abusing them as Noah did on this occasion. And so the lesson that we take from this is that even though God has blessed us with a great many things, that doesn't mean that every possible use of the blessings that God has given us is something that's good. There are a lot of ways that we can misuse and abuse and sin with the good things that we have in this world that God has provided. So we need to be careful. And this, again, goes back to the point that we made earlier about authority. Not just assume that, well, okay, this is something that God has provided, and so I can just use it any way I want to. No, we have to see what God has authorized. We have to see what is pleasing to Him, and then use those blessings in a way that honors Him and follows His will. So we think about what happened with Noah and the flood. Noah and his family were saved through the ark and all the animals with them, and then they get past the flood. Then they get to where they are no longer on the ark. They're able to get off the ark. We need to learn lessons from that time period as well. Lessons about following God and respecting His authority, not making assumptions about what we think is right, waiting to see what God has instructed, waiting to see what His will is, doing those things that He wants us to do, making worship and our service to Him a priority, and not abusing those good things that He has given us. Because He has provided us with every good thing to enjoy in this life. He provides us with salvation. That the example of Noah is an example showing us the salvation that God is able to provide, where it's not just salvation through the flood, salvation from sin. We can have a hope of eternal life in heaven. That is available from God, but we have to follow Him. We have to honor Him. We have to be obedient to Him. And so let's look at Noah. Not only the example of Noah building the ark and being saved from the flood, but look at what happened after the flood. Let's make serving God a priority and worshiping Him a priority. Let's make sure we're doing everything according to His will and not abusing the things that He provides us, but instead doing all things to His honor and glory.